There are men in this world who walk freely on the streets despite leaving a trail of blood behind them. David Hunt is one of those men. Standing at 6 feet 5 inches tall, they call him the long fella in the criminal underworld of London. But height isn't what makes him terrifying. It's what he's done with that presence and, more importantly, what he's gotten away with that should keep us all awake at night. The year is 1961. Canning Town, a gritty corner of East London where the docks meet poverty, where families squeeze into cramped council housing, and where opportunity means something very different than it does in the wealthy neighborhoods just miles away. In one of those council homes lived May and George Hunt, and on an April day that year, their 13th child was born. They named him David Charles Hunt. 13 children. Let that sink in for a moment. The youngest of 13 children growing up in a neighborhood that the rest of London had forgotten. The Hunts were working class in every sense of the word. Canning Town in the early 1960s wasn't a place of dreams. It was a place of survival. The post-industrial decline had hit hard, leaving behind communities struggling to make ends meet, where the line between legal and illegal work often blurred out of necessity. Young David Hunt grew up in those cramped quarters, watching his older siblings navigate a world that offered them very little. His parents, by all accounts, were Christian people who tried to instill a strong work ethic in their children. But when you're the youngest of 13 in a council estate, you learn quickly that the world doesn't owe you anything. You learn to fight for what you want. You learn to use whatever advantages you have. And David Hunt had one very clear advantage from an early age. He was big. Not just tall, but physically imposing in a way that commanded attention and eventually fear. By the time he was a teenager, Hunt had already discovered boxing. He left school at 16, like so many kids from his neighborhood, and threw himself into the amateur boxing circuit. Those who remember him from those days talk about a ferocious fighter, someone who brought an intensity to the ring that went beyond sport. It was personal. It was about proving something. But boxing alone wasn't going to build the kind of life Hunt wanted. Around him, he saw other paths to power and money. Canning Town and the broader East End had a long history with organized crime. The Cray twins had ruled these streets in the previous generation, creating a template that ambitious young men studied carefully. Violence, loyalty, intimidation, and the careful cultivation of both fear and respect. These were the tools that built empires in East London. By the mid-1980s, David Hunt was no longer just a boxer trying to make a name in the ring. He had joined a street gang called the Snipers, and this was where his real education began. The Snipers weren't small time. They were involved in lorry hijackings across Essex and East London, a profitable business that required organization, muscle, and the willingness to use violence when necessary. What made this even more significant was that Hunt wasn't just joining a gang, he was joining a family business. 6 members of his own family were already in the Snipers, and police intelligence reports would later identify David and his brother Stephen as 2 of the 6 main leaders. Think about that structure for a moment. This wasn't some random collection of criminals. This was a family operation, with blood ties creating bonds that were harder to break than ordinary criminal associations. When the police came after them, those family connections meant something. They meant loyalty. They meant silence. And David Hunt needed that loyalty because the police were indeed coming after him. Between 1984 and the end of the decade, Hunt was arrested 7 times. 7 separate occasions where law enforcement had enough evidence to bring him in, to charge him with crimes ranging from assault to robbery to criminal damage. But here's where the pattern began that would define Hunt's entire criminal career. Witnesses would drop their allegations every single time. People who had been ready to testify would suddenly change their minds. Evidence would crumble. Cases would fall apart. Only once did anything stick. In 1986, Hunt was convicted and given a 9-month suspended sentence for handling stolen goods and possession of a sawn-off shotgun. A suspended sentence. He walked away without serving a day in prison. Even then, at the beginning of his criminal career, the system was failing to hold him accountable, but Hunt was learning. With each arrest, with each case that collapsed, he was learning how the system worked and, more importantly, how to work the system. A police intelligence report from 1985 noted that Hunt was moving up the ladder, taking on more responsibility in overseeing gang operations. He wasn't just muscle anymore, he was becoming management. The late 1980s marked a turning point. Hunt saw the profits that could be made in Soho, the famous neighborhood in central London known for its nightlife and its darker elements. While his family members continued operations in East London, Hunt began purchasing properties in Soho, but these weren't ordinary investment properties. One location became a pornography shop, another operated as a brothel. Hunt was moving into the sex trade, an industry that brought in steady money and, crucially, gave him leverage over people. People with secrets, people with shame, people who could be controlled. Police intelligence reports from this period paint a picture of a man at the center of an expanding web. Protection rackets at nightclubs and pubs, threats of violence to business owners who didn't pay up. The systematic expansion of influence through fear. Hunt was no longer just participating in crime, he was organizing it. He was building something that would later be called the Hunt Syndicate. And this syndicate had a particular way of staying ahead of law enforcement. In the late 1990s, the Metropolitan Police launched Operation Blackjack, a long-term surveillance operation targeting Hunt and his associates. They even managed to plant listening devices in locations Hunt frequented, including a car showroom. On one of those recordings, they captured Hunt slashing the face of a man named Paul Kavanagh, someone who had upset one of Hunt's associates. Finally, they had him, direct evidence of a violent assault. Hunt was arrested and charged. This should have been the moment when justice caught up with him, but Paul Kavanagh withdrew his statement. The prosecution dropped the case. Years later, a high court judge would determine that Hunt had intimidated Kavanagh into silence, but by then it didn't matter. Hunt walked free. This became the pattern. Evidence would emerge, witnesses would come forward, cases would be built. And then somehow everything would fall apart. Witnesses would recant, evidence would be questioned, key details would mysteriously fail to hold up in court. To the police officers investigating Hunt, it became increasingly clear that something else was going on. Something deeper and more disturbing than simple witness intimidation. The truth, when it eventually emerged, was worse than anyone had imagined. Hunt hadn't just intimidated witnesses. He had infiltrated the very institutions meant to stop him. In 2002, the Metropolitan Police launched an internal investigation called Operation Tiberius. It was meant to examine how organized crime groups in North and East London had managed to evade prosecution for so long. What they discovered was a cancer at the heart of London's law enforcement. The Tiberius report, which would later be leaked and cause a massive scandal, revealed that the Hunt Syndicate had been using corrupt police officers to stay one step ahead of investigations. Not just one or two rogue cops. Multiple officers, some of them senior detectives, who were feeding information to Hunt's organization. They would tip off the syndicate about planned raids. They would provide advance warning about investigations. They would access police databases to find out what evidence existed and who was cooperating with authorities. The report specifically named several officers who were suspected of working for Hunt, including former senior detectives who had retired but maintained contacts within the force. One passage from Tiberius stated that a particular officer was the main source of their information, and that even after retirement, he would undoubtedly maintain links with serving officers, changing from the corrupted role to that of a conduit. According to the Tiberius findings, the Hunt Syndicate had achieved something remarkable and terrifying. They had developed what the report called an extensive criminal empire, which so far has evaded significant penetration from law enforcement. The report went on to explain how. The syndicate has achieved this invulnerability through a mixture of utilizing corrupt police contacts and the intimidation of witnesses brave enough to give evidence against them. The report also noted that the Hunt Syndicate is one of the most violent groups in northeast London and has been responsible for a series of vicious assaults against debtors and rivals. This wasn't just about theft or fraud. This was about violence as a business tool, used systematically to maintain control and spread fear. To understand how deep the corruption ran, you need to understand what happened to the police officers who tried to fight it. Detective Chief Inspector David McKelvey, known as Mac to his colleagues, was one of the dedicated officers who refused to look the other way. In 2006, his crime squad in Newham, East London, searched a scrapyard in Canning Town for stolen metal. What they found went far beyond that. In a nearby property, they discovered 42 containers holding the contents of 18 lorry thefts and a commercial burglary, along with counterfeit goods. McKelvey had stumbled onto something significant. As he dug deeper, he discovered that the gang had been corrupting police officers for over a decade. More than that, he learned that a gang insider had been leaking information to police about the criminal operations, but that information had never been acted upon. Someone inside the police force had been burying evidence. McKelvey pushed forward anyway. He built a case with overwhelming evidence against Hunt and his organization, but then something strange happened. Instead of Hunt being arrested, McKelvey himself came under investigation. The Professional Standards Unit, the division meant to root out corrupt police officers, turned their attention to McKelvey. For 2 years, they investigated him, examining every aspect of his work, trying to find something wrong with how he had built his case against Hunt. Think about the message that sends. A detective does his job, follows the evidence, builds a strong case against organized crime, and gets investigated for it. The case against Hunt collapsed. McKelvey was eventually exonerated, with Detective Chief Superintendent Albert Patrick stating that he struggled to understand what McKelvey was being accused of in the first place. But by then, the damage was done. The investigation fell apart. Hunt remained free, and McKelvey received an even darker message. While interviewing a petty criminal during the investigation, he was informed that there was a contract out on his life. Not a vague threat, a specific contract with a specific price, £1 million. Hunt had allegedly summoned a Yardie hitman named Carl Robinson, known as the Dread, to a boat in Marbella and instructed him to kill 3 police officers, including McKelvey himself. When McKelvey and his colleagues reported this threat to their superiors, what happened next defies belief. Instead of investigating the death threat, instead of protecting the officers who were clearly in danger, the Metropolitan Police suspended McKelvey and his fellow detectives and investigated them for corruption. 3 officers who had been doing their jobs, who had uncovered a massive criminal enterprise, who now had credible death threats against them, were treated like criminals themselves. They were later cleared of any wrongdoing, but the pattern was clear. Hunt had protection at multiple levels. It wasn't just that he had corrupt officers feeding him information. It was that the corruption went high enough that officers who tried to investigate Hunt could be neutralized by having their own careers destroyed. McKelvey now lives under round-the-clock police protection, a permanent reminder of the price he paid for trying to do his job. Meanwhile, Hunt expanded his empire. By the 1990s and 2000s, he wasn't just running criminal operations. He was building a property portfolio, using various companies to purchase real estate across London and the surrounding areas. One of his key properties was in Soho at 2 Greens Court. Hunt had acquired this building through a Jersey-based company called Galleon's Reach Limited for £240,000 in 1995. The money came from unclear sources, raising immediate questions about money laundering. What happened at 2 Greens Court tells you everything about how Hunt operated. The basement functioned as a clip joint, one of those establishments where customers were lured in with promises of sexual services, then overcharged exorbitant sums under threat of violence if they didn't pay. The ground floor operated as a sex shop. The upper floors housed brothels. This single property was generating income from multiple illegal activities simultaneously, all funneled through what appeared on paper to be a legitimate property company. Hunt set up multiple companies to handle his various operations. His waste disposal business, Hunt's Waste Recycling in Dagenham, became particularly significant. The scrap metal and waste disposal industry is perfect for organized crime. It handles cash transactions, provides legitimate cover for illegal activities, and offers opportunities to launder money by mixing criminal proceeds with legitimate business income. Police suspected that Hunt was using this business as a front for criminal activities, with the scrap yard serving as a hub for handling stolen goods. The business was successful enough that it became quite valuable. But in August 2012, during the closing ceremony of the London Olympics, something remarkable happened. Hunt's Waste Recycling became the site of what fire officials called the largest fire in London in several years. 40 fire engines and over 200 firefighters rushed to the scene as flames consumed the facility. The fire was officially ruled accidental, but the timing raised questions. The Olympics had brought intense scrutiny to East London. Property values were skyrocketing as the area was redeveloped. Hunt had been involved in various land deals connected to the Olympic developments, and there had been allegations about his role in gangland disputes over land that the government had been purchasing for the Olympic Park. Was the fire truly an accident, or was it connected to Hunt's activities in some way? The answers remain unclear, but the incident highlighted how Hunt's legitimate businesses often seemed to be surrounded by suspicious circumstances. Throughout all of this, Hunt maintained his public image as a legitimate businessman. He described himself as a property tycoon, a self-made man who had built a successful empire through hard work. He purchased a 7-bedroom mansion called the Morleys in Woodside Green, Great Hallingbury, right on the border of Essex and Hertfordshire. The property was impressive: swimming pool, tennis courts, gymnasium, and guard dog pens. He bought it in September 1993 for £600,000, but here's the thing that's almost funny if it weren't so serious. In 2013, during court proceedings, it was revealed that Hunt had not declared any income or paid any taxes between 1982 and 1996. 14 years without declaring income or paying taxes. When asked in court how he had managed to afford a £600,000 mansion during this period, Hunt was unable to recall. He simply couldn't explain where the money had come from. This wasn't an oversight, this was systematic. Hunt was running multiple businesses, purchasing multiple properties, expanding his operations year after year, and not paying a penny in taxes while claiming he couldn't remember how he afforded his lifestyle. The audacity is breathtaking, but Hunt did more than just avoid taxes. In 2016, the Panama Papers leak revealed that Hunt was a client of Mossack Fonseca, the law firm that specialized in helping wealthy individuals hide their money in offshore accounts. Hunt owned an offshore company called EMM Limited, which held ownership of an iron and steel business in East London. The use of offshore companies allowed Hunt to obscure who actually owned what, making it harder for authorities to track his assets or follow the money trail from his criminal activities. Hunt also cultivated connections to the legitimate world in ways that gave him both cover and credibility. He became friendly with Reggie Kray, one half of the infamous Kray twins who had ruled East London's underworld in the 1960s. Hunt visited Kray in prison in 2000, just before Kray's death. When questioned about this later, Hunt downplayed the relationship, claiming he had only visited Kray once or twice and that it meant nothing. But to those in the criminal underworld, those visits meant everything. They were a symbol, the old guard passing the torch to the new, the long fella positioning himself as the heir to a criminal legacy. In 2004, another crack appeared in Hunt's carefully constructed facade. A book titled Judas Pig was published under the pseudonym Horace Silver. It was presented as fiction, a novel about a career criminal named Billy Abrahams and his various exploits in the criminal underworld of the 1980s and 1990s. The names were changed, the author used a false name, but everyone knew what Judas Pig really was. It was a thinly disguised autobiography written by Jimmy Holmes, a former associate of Hunt who had worked alongside him for years. In the book, Hunt appears as a character named Danny, described as Abraham's psychopathic partner in crime. Danny is portrayed as a violent gangland boss responsible for numerous murders and serious assaults while running drugs, pornography, and protection operations across London and Essex. The book details how Danny and Abrahams eventually fall out, and Danny puts a contract on Abraham's life. It was shocking, it was specific, and it was protected by being published as fiction with changed names. But in 2013, Holmes published a follow-up called The Charity Committee, and this time he used real names. Hunt's name was in there in black and white. The book was quickly withdrawn from sale, apparently after legal pressure, and became difficult to obtain. Amazon removed it, but copies existed. The information was out there. Someone who had worked closely with Hunt had broken the code of silence and put the truth on paper. And then came the moment when Hunt's world should have collapsed entirely. In May 2010, the Sunday Times published an investigation by journalist Michael Gillard that changed everything. The article alleged that Hunt was the head of a vast criminal network in London's East End, involved in extortion rackets, protection schemes, drug trafficking, fraud, and violence. The article stated that Scotland Yard viewed Hunt's gang as too big and too dangerous to take on effectively. The article was based on leaked police and serious organized crime agency documents, including portions of the Operation Tiberius report. Finally, the carefully hidden truth was being exposed to the public. The documents detailed decades of criminal activity, the corruption of police officers, the systematic intimidation of witnesses, and the violence used to maintain control. Hunt's response was to do what many criminals do when confronted with the truth. He sued for libel. He claimed that the article was false, that it had crucified him, that it had broken his heart. He portrayed himself in court as a rough diamond, a businessman from a tough background who had built a legitimate empire. His lawyer, Hugh Tomlinson QC, argued that Hunt's only passions in life were his family and racing pigeons. Racing pigeons, they wanted the court to believe that this man, who police reports described as the head of a violent criminal syndicate, was just a simple man who loved his family and enjoyed a harmless hobby. The trial lasted 3 weeks in May 2013, and it was extraordinary. The Sunday Times had to rely on those leaked documents as evidence, which meant first winning a separate legal battle about whether they could use them at all. The Metropolitan Police had tried to sue the Sunday Times to recover the documents and ban their publication. That attempt failed, but the Met launched an internal investigation to try to find who had leaked the documents to the newspaper, treating the leak as a bigger problem than the corruption and organized crime the documents revealed. During the trial, the Sunday Times employed 5 professional bodyguards to protect their witnesses, people who were going to testify about Hunt's activities. On the second day of the trial, something disturbing happened. Those bodyguards walked off the job after being approached in a pub. They wouldn't say exactly what was said to them, but they made it clear they were done. Another security firm refused to take the contract. Even professional security personnel, people trained to deal with danger, wanted nothing to do with protecting witnesses against Hunt. The trial revealed incident after incident. There was testimony about a journalist named Peter Wilson, who had tried to investigate Hunt's involvement in unsolved murders back in 1992. Wilson worked for the Sunday Mirror and had gone to Hunt's home to ask questions about the murders of Maxine Arnold and Terry Gooderam. Hunt wasn't home, but Wilson left his business card. When Hunt returned and learned about the visit, he was furious. Wilson came back later, and what happened next was captured in Wilson's own statement. Hunt grabbed him by the lapels and violently headbutted him just above the right eye. Wilson didn't resist, he offered no fight. Hunt then said to him, "You fucking." Wilson suffered a fractured orbital bone. He filed a complaint but then withdrew it. In court, Hunt denied the attack happened, but the judge didn't believe him. The judge concluded that Hunt was lying, that the attack had occurred exactly as Wilson described, and that Wilson had been intimidated into dropping his complaint. Then there was the testimony about Billy Allen, a property developer who crossed paths with Hunt in 2006. There was a dispute over money and property. Surveillance video from that period shows Hunt arriving at a building with his brother Stephen, his nephew David, and several heavily built men. Allen testified that Hunt shouted at him, "Fuck off now. I'll kill you and your family, you little cunt. I'm going to kill you. Enough's enough." Someone with Hunt added, "Run, Bill." Allen saw men coming toward him and ran. The judge examined the evidence, listened to the testimony, reviewed the documents, and on July 1, 2013, delivered his verdict. Hunt lost his libel case. The judge didn't just rule against him. The judge made findings that destroyed Hunt's carefully crafted public image. Lord Justice Simon stated in his judgment that it was reasonable to describe the claimant as a violent and dangerous criminal, and the head of an organized crime group implicated in murder, drug trafficking, and fraud. The judge couldn't prove every specific allegation, like direct involvement in particular murders, but he was convinced that Hunt used violence and intimidation to scare witnesses and avoid prosecution. More than that, the judge found that Hunt had engaged in money laundering through his various property companies and offshore arrangements. This was a high court judge, examining evidence under oath, making official findings that Hunt was exactly what the Sunday Times had called him. A crime lord running a vast criminal network. It should have been over. Hunt should have faced criminal charges based on these findings. The evidence was there. A judge had made determinations about his criminal activities. But that's not what happened. Hunt was ordered to pay the Sunday Times £805,000 in legal costs. That's a staggering sum, enough to bankrupt most people, but Hunt had resources. He had built an empire worth, by some estimates, around £23 million in property alone. Still, £805,000 was significant enough that Hunt needed to find financing quickly. Here's where the story takes another disturbing turn. Barclays Bank had previously lent Hunt's company, Hunt's UK Properties, around £4.2 million. When a manager at Barclays read the news reports about Hunt's libel trial and the judge's damning findings, the bank called in the loan. They wanted their money back. They didn't want to be associated with someone who had just been declared by a court to be the head of an organized crime syndicate. But Hunt found another bank willing to lend him the money, Lloyd's. And not just any Lloyd's, but Lloyd's TSB, which at the time was partially owned by British taxpayers following the 2008 financial crisis. taxpayer money helping to finance a convicted organized crime boss. Lloyd's lent Hunt up to £5 million secured against his properties, including using his £1 million life insurance policy as partial collateral. He had taken out that life insurance policy in April 2013, right as the trial was heating up. It was a policy for £1 million through Legal & General, set to expire in 2028. Think about that insurance policy for a moment. This wasn't about providing for his family if something happened to him. This was about having a financial asset he could use as collateral for loans. And why would someone need to secure a life insurance policy right before a major trial? The timing suggests someone who knew that his financial arrangements were about to come under serious scrutiny and was making sure he had assets that could be leveraged no matter what happened. But Hunt needed even more money to cover his costs, and this is where things get truly remarkable in terms of the connections Hunt had built. David Sullivan, the co-chairman of West Ham United Football Club, lent Hunt £1 million. Sullivan made his original fortune in the pornography industry before moving into sports ownership, eventually buying West Ham with David Gold in 2010. The loan came from Sullivan's finance company, GC Co. No. 102, to Hunt's business Hunt's UK Properties. When this loan was revealed by journalists Carl Fellstrom and Michael Gillard, there was public outcry. A member of the Treasury Select Committee suggested that the Financial Conduct Authority should investigate the loans. How could a man who had just lost a libel trial, who had been declared by a judge to be a crime boss, get a £1 million loan from the co-owner of a major football club? What was the relationship there? Sullivan's spokesman claimed it was a normal commercial loan at a normal commercial rate. Hunt's spokesman said Hunt ran a perfectly legitimate property company that borrowed money from time to time like any business. But photographs that emerged showed Sullivan, Gold, and Hunt together at various events, including at West Ham games. Hunt wasn't just some distant business associate. These were men who spent social time together, who appeared comfortable in each other's company. The loan looked less like a standard commercial transaction and more like something else entirely. After the trial, Michael Gillard, the Sunday Times journalist who had written the original exposé, won the British Journalism Award for Journalist of the Year in 2013. It was recognition of extraordinary reporting, the kind of investigative journalism that holds power accountable. But Gillard couldn't attend the ceremony. He couldn't attend any public events in London. The security risks were too great. Gillard had exposed Hunt, and like McKelvey before him, he now lived under the shadow of potential retaliation. The police officers who had testified at the trial fared no better. McKelvey and Detective Sergeant Darren Guntrip, who had given evidence supporting the Sunday Times defense, found themselves targeted by their own force. They were subjected to criminal investigations based on what they would later describe as flawed evidence, discredited intelligence, and information the Met knew to be false. McKelvey had already been investigated once. Now he and Guntrip were being investigated again, their careers being destroyed for the crime of telling the truth. Eventually, after years of fighting, McKelvey and Guntrip sued the Metropolitan Police for misfeasance in public office, false imprisonment, and malicious procurement of search warrants. They won. The Met was forced to apologize and pay substantial financial compensation. The Met admitted that the investigations against them had been wrong, but by then, the damage to their careers and lives was done. And the message to other officers was clear: go after Hunt and this is what happens to you. In March 2016, the BBC's Panorama program broadcast an episode titled Cops, Criminals, Corruption. The Inside Story. It detailed much of what had been revealed by Operation Tiberius, including the extent to which organized crime had infiltrated the Metropolitan Police. The program covered Hunt specifically, discussing the death threats against the officers investigating him and how those officers had then been investigated for corruption instead of being protected. The program revealed new details about the murder contract Hunt had allegedly put out. Carl Robinson, the Dread, was a known hitman who Hunt had allegedly met with in Marbella, Spain. Hunt had supposedly offered him £1 million to kill McKelvey and 2 other officers. Robinson had a reputation in certain circles as someone who could get this kind of job done. The contract was specific. These weren't vague threats. This was an organized plan to murder police officers. Intelligence about the contract reached the police. McKelvey and his colleagues were informed that their lives were in danger. And rather than launching a major investigation into who was trying to have police officers killed, rather than treating this as the serious crime it was, the Metropolitan Police's response was to investigate the threatened officers themselves. It's almost impossible to comprehend that institutional response. Officers facing credible death threats were treated as if they were the problem. The corruption that Operation Tiberius had documented wasn't just about a few bad apples. It was systemic. The report had identified dozens of corrupt officers, both serving and retired. These officers were providing information to multiple organized crime groups, not just Hunt's syndicate. The Addams family, another major crime organization in North London, was also benefiting from corrupt police contacts. John Palmer, one of the wealthiest gangsters in Britain, had been protected by corrupt officers according to the Tiberius files. What the report showed was that these crime syndicates had infiltrated police databases. They could look up who was investigating them, what evidence existed, which witnesses were cooperating. They could track investigations in real time and adjust accordingly. When a witness came forward, they knew about it. When a raid was being planned, they knew when and where. This wasn't just having a source feed you occasional tips. This was having access to the police's entire investigative apparatus. The Tiberius report also documented how organized crime had used Freemasonry connections to recruit corrupt officers. Many of the suspected corrupt officers were Freemasons, and the report suggested this networking was being exploited to create corrupt relationships. This particular detail was included in the Independent's reporting on the Tiberius leak, but was notably absent from the BBC's panorama coverage, raising questions about what information was being held back and why. Throughout all of this, Hunt maintained his position. He denied any involvement in organized crime. He insisted he was a legitimate businessman being targeted by rogue elements within the police and by a newspaper with an agenda. His lawyer, Matthew Jenkins, consistently stated that Mr. Hunt is a legitimate businessman who has never had any involvement in organized crime in any form. When the Tiberius report was leaked online, Jenkins noted that Hunt was hardly mentioned in it, which was technically true in that Hunt's name appeared less frequently than the document's focus on his syndicate and associates. But the evidence told a different story: the testimony of witnesses who had been intimidated, the findings of a high court judge, the leaked police documents, the pattern of collapsed prosecutions, the corrupt officer network. The offshore companies, the unexplained wealth, the death threats against investigators, the connections to known criminals. Every piece fitted into a larger picture of a man who had built a criminal empire and then systematically protected it through violence, corruption, and intimidation. Hunt's story is important not just because of what one man did, but because of what it reveals about how systems can fail. The Metropolitan Police, one of the most respected police forces in the world, had been infiltrated by organized crime to such an extent that officers investigating crime bosses ended up being investigated themselves. Banks, including a taxpayer-funded bank, provided financing to someone who had been declared by a court to be a crime lord. The justice system built strong cases that then collapsed when witnesses recanted. The legal system allowed Hunt to use libel law to try to silence journalism, and even when he lost that case, he didn't face criminal prosecution. At every level, institutions failed. And at every level, Hunt exploited those failures. He understood that the system had weaknesses. Witnesses could be intimidated, officers could be corrupted, evidence could be compromised, money could be hidden offshore. Legitimate businesses could be used as fronts, and if you were bold enough, if you were violent enough, if you were organized enough, you could build an empire that was visible to everyone and untouchable by anyone. The judges who examined Hunt's case saw this clearly. Lord Justice Simon concluded that Hunt had run his criminal network through extreme violence. When someone crossed him, when someone threatened his business, when someone talked to authorities, Hunt's response was swift and brutal. The slashing of Paul Kavanagh's face wasn't about one dispute. It was a message to everyone else. This is what happens when you step out of line. The threats against Billy Allen weren't just about a property deal gone wrong. They were about demonstrating power and control. The alleged contract on the police officers wasn't defensive. It was about eliminating people who had dared to effectively investigate him. And the most chilling part of Hunt's story is that it worked. He is still free. He has never been convicted of the serious crimes that multiple investigations documented. His property empire, while perhaps smaller than its peak, still exists. He lives in his mansion. He operates his businesses. The men who investigated him have their careers destroyed or live under police protection. The journalist who exposed him can't attend public events in London. The witnesses who testified against him live in fear. This is what it means when police reports say someone is too big to bring down. It doesn't mean they're untouchable because they're powerful in the traditional sense. It means they've created a situation where attempting to bring them down creates so much collateral damage, compromises so many people, reveals so much institutional failure, that it becomes easier to just look the other way. To let them operate, to pretend that nothing can be done. There's a peculiar detail in police intelligence reports that tells you something profound about David Hunt. Among all the violence, the intimidation, the corruption, and the criminal empire worth millions, police noted that Hunt's syndicate included family members and the father of Mark Wright, a well-known reality television star from The Only Way is Essex. This wasn't just a random connection. Mark Wright Sr., the father of the celebrity, had known Stephen Hunt for 30 years and David Hunt for 25. They had run a car business together in the 1990s. This connection matters because it illustrates how Hunt's world operated. He wasn't some distant figure hidden in the shadows. He was woven into the social fabric of East London and Essex. He went to football matches with legitimate businessmen. His associates included the fathers of television celebrities. He attended social events. He was visible, normal. Just another successful businessman from Canning Town who had done well for himself. That's the genius of Hunt's approach and what makes his story so disturbing. He wasn't operating in some hidden underworld that the rest of society never sees. He was operating in plain sight, mixing criminal enterprise with legitimate business, social connections, and community presence. The scrap metal business wasn't just a front. It was a real business that employed people, handled contracts, and appeared on tax rolls. The property empire wasn't just money laundering. It was actual real estate that could be bought, sold, and developed like any other investment portfolio. This blending of legitimate and illegitimate made Hunt nearly impossible to prosecute. When police looked at his businesses, they saw what appeared to be normal commercial operations. When they examined his property holdings, the ownership structures were complex but not obviously criminal. When they investigated his social connections, they found businessmen, football club owners, and even connections to celebrity families. Everything had a veneer of legitimacy that made it difficult to prove criminal intent, but underneath that veneer was something else entirely. The 2012 London Olympics provides a perfect case study of how Hunt operated and what his real impact was on East London. When London won the bid to host the Olympics, billions of pounds began flowing into East London for regeneration. The Olympic Park would be built in Stratford, right in Hunt's territory. The government needed to purchase land, clear sites, and prepare for the massive construction project. For organized crime, this was an opportunity unlike any other. Land that had been worth relatively little suddenly had immense value. Contracts for waste removal, security, construction, and 100 other services would be worth millions. Anyone who controlled territory or had influence over local businesses could potentially profit enormously from the Olympic windfall. According to Michael Gillard's book, Legacy, Gangsters, Corruption, and the London Olympics, published in 2019, a turf war broke out between crime families for control of valuable strips of land in East London. Using violence, corruption, and intimidation, Hunt emerged from this conflict as what Gillard called a true untouchable. The book details how Hunt's syndicate allegedly became embroiled in disputes over land the government was purchasing for the Olympics, with accusations that Hunt deployed enforcers to intimidate rivals and secure financial gains. The fire at Hunt's waste recycling in August 2012, during the Olympic closing ceremony, takes on new significance in this context. 40 fire engines and over 200 firefighters battling the largest fire in London in several years, all at a facility owned by Hunt, right as the Olympics were concluding. Was it truly an accident, or was it connected to the criminal disputes over Olympic-related opportunities? The official finding was accidental, but the timing and location raised questions that were never fully answered. What we know for certain is that Hunt's businesses and property holdings expanded during this period. His use of offshore companies, revealed in the Panama Papers, allowed him to obscure ownership and move money without easy detection. His connections to legitimate businesses and financiers gave him access to capital and opportunities that most criminals could never obtain. And his corruption of police officers meant he could operate without effective oversight or intervention. But there's a human cost to all of this that goes beyond statistics about money laundered or properties owned. Real people's lives were destroyed by Hunt's operations. Some of them we know about, many more we don't. Think about Paul Kavanagh, the man whose face Hunt slashed in a car showroom while police listening devices were recording. Kavanagh was someone who had upset one of Hunt's associates. Not Hunt himself, but someone in his organization, and for that, Kavanagh had his face cut open. When he tried to press charges, when he tried to get justice through the legal system, he was intimidated into withdrawing his statement. A high court judge would later find that Hunt had intimidated him into silence, but by then it was years later and the criminal case had long since collapsed. What happened to Kavanagh after that? Did he leave London? Did he live in fear? Did the scar on his face serve as a permanent reminder to him and everyone who saw him about what happens when you cross the Hunt syndicate? We don't know those details. He's just one name in court documents, one incident among many, one person whose life was violently altered and who never saw justice. Or consider Billy Allen, the property developer who got into a dispute with Hunt in 2006. Allen testified that Hunt threatened him directly, saying he would kill Allen and his family, calling him names, telling him to run. Allen saw men coming toward him and he did run. He ran for his life. After that incident, what was Allen's life like? Could he continue his property development business in East London? Did he move? Did he spend years looking over his shoulder? Again, we don't know. He's another name in court transcripts, another person who crossed Hunt's path and was threatened with death. Then there's Peter Wilson, the Sunday Mirror journalist who went to Hunt's home in 1992 to ask questions about 2 unsolved murders. Hunt grabbed Wilson and head-butted him with such force that it fractured Wilson's orbital bone, the bone around his eye. Wilson filed a complaint, then withdrew it. The judge in the 2013 trial found that Wilson had been intimidated into silence. But what about Wilson's career after that? Did he continue investigating organized crime? Did that moment change how he approached journalism? Did he carry physical and emotional scars from that encounter for the rest of his life? These are the visible victims, the ones who ended up in court documents and trial testimony. But for every Paul Kavanagh, Billy Allen, and Peter Wilson, how many others were there? How many shop owners paid protection money to avoid having their businesses destroyed? How many witnesses saw crimes but refused to come forward because they knew what happened to people who talked? How many police officers chose not to investigate certain crimes because they saw what happened to officers who did? DCI David McKelvey is perhaps the most visible example of what happened to those who tried to hold Hunt accountable. McKelvey was, by all accounts, an excellent police officer. He was dedicated, competent, and driven by a genuine desire to make his community safer. In 2006, when his crime squad discovered evidence of Hunt's operations, McKelvey did what police officers are supposed to do. He built a case, he gathered evidence, he worked to bring criminals to justice. For this, McKelvey's career was destroyed. He was investigated for 2 years by the Professional Standards Unit based on what would later be determined to be flawed or false allegations. When he was eventually cleared, the case against Hunt had collapsed, but worse than the career damage was the threat to his life. McKelvey learned that Hunt had allegedly put out a contract on his life for £1 million, hiring a hitman to kill him and 2 other officers. Today, McKelvey lives under round-the-clock police protection. Think about what that means. He's a man who did his job, who tried to enforce the law, who worked to protect his community, and for that, he can't attend public events. He can't live a normal life. He requires armed guards 24 hours a day because a criminal he tried to investigate has allegedly threatened to have him murdered. And the criminal who made that threat continues to walk free, living in his mansion, running his businesses, appearing at social events. Detective Sergeant Darren Guntrip, who worked with McKelvey and testified at the libel trial supporting the Sunday Times, faced similar treatment. He and McKelvey were subjected to what they would later describe as malicious investigations. They eventually sued the Metropolitan Police and won, receiving an apology and financial compensation. But that came years later, after their careers had been damaged and their lives disrupted. The Metropolitan Police admitted the investigations had been wrong, but the officers had already paid an enormous price for telling the truth. Michael Gillard, the Sunday Times journalist who exposed Hunt, also lives with the consequences. After winning British Journalism Awards Journalist of the Year in 2013 for his exposé, Gillard couldn't attend the awards ceremony. He can't attend public events in London. He received an Osman warning from the National Crime Agency, a formal notification that there's a credible threat to his life. For doing exemplary journalism, for exposing corruption and organized crime, Gillard now lives in a state of permanent caution. These aren't abstract concepts. These are real people whose lives have been fundamentally altered because they tried to do the right thing. They tried to enforce the law, report the truth, seek justice, and the system they believed in failed them completely. But the failure goes deeper than individual cases. It's systemic. Tom Harper's 2022 book, Broken Yard, The Fall of the Metropolitan Police, examines how the Met descended from a position of global respect to an organization riven with corruption, misogyny, and incompetence. Harper, an investigative journalist who covered Scotland Yard for 15 years, documents how organized crime penetrated the police force to such an extent that the institution's primary function became protecting itself rather than serving the public. The Operation Tiberius report is central to this story. When it was leaked, it revealed something that should have triggered a massive reform of British policing. Multiple organized crime groups, not just Hunt's syndicate, had corrupted serving and retired police officers. These officers were providing intelligence, tipping off criminals about raids, accessing databases to identify witnesses and informants, and actively undermining investigations. The corruption wasn't isolated to a few bad apples. It was systematic and extensive. And what was the Metropolitan Police's response to this revelation? They tried to sue the Sunday Times to get the documents back and ban their publication. They launched an investigation to find who leaked the documents, treating the leak as a bigger problem than the corruption the documents revealed. They investigated the officers who had tried to expose the corruption rather than investigating the corrupt officers themselves. They protected the institution at the expense of justice. This institutional failure has implications that extend far beyond David Hunt. It means that for decades, organized crime operated in London with the knowledge and sometimes assistance of police officers who were supposed to stop them. It means that witnesses who came forward were identified and intimidated because corrupt officers leaked their information. It means that investigations were compromised before they even began because criminals knew what evidence existed and what raids were planned. The communities most affected by this were the working-class neighborhoods of East London where Hunt operated, places like Canning Town, Newham, and the broader Docklands area. These were communities that desperately needed effective policing. They had high crime rates, economic challenges, and limited resources. The failure of the police to effectively tackle organized crime meant these communities continued to suffer. Business owners in these areas faced a choice: pay protection money or risk violence. Witnesses to crime stayed silent because they knew the risks of coming forward. Young people growing up in these neighborhoods saw that criminals like Hunt lived in mansions and drove expensive cars, while the police who tried to stop them ended up investigated or threatened. What message did that send about the value of following the law? The Olympics should have been a turning point for East London. Billions of pounds of investment, new infrastructure, regeneration of neglected areas, jobs and opportunities. And some of that did happen. The Olympic Park is now Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, a public space with sports facilities, walking trails, and cultural venues. The surrounding areas have seen development and investment. But the regeneration also created opportunities for organized crime to profit. The turf wars over land, the contracts for services, the displacement of existing communities and businesses, some of whom were vulnerable to exploitation or intimidation. The legacy of the Olympics in East London is complex, and part of that complexity includes how criminals like Hunt allegedly positioned themselves to benefit from public investment meant to improve communities. Hunt's continued freedom is perhaps the most disturbing element of this story. After the 2013 libel trial, after a high court judge made findings that Hunt was a violent and dangerous criminal heading an organized crime group, after all the evidence had been publicly aired, Hunt faced no criminal prosecution. The judge's findings should have triggered immediate action. Instead, Hunt borrowed money to pay his legal costs and continued operating his businesses. His loan from David Sullivan, the co-chairman of West Ham United, raises troubling questions about the connections between legitimate business and organized crime. Sullivan made his fortune in the pornography industry before becoming a football club owner, and Hunt had also operated in the sex trade through his Soho properties. What was the nature of their relationship? Was it purely a commercial loan as Sullivan's representatives claimed, or was there something deeper there? The photographs of Sullivan, his West Ham co-chairman David Gold, and Hunt together at various events suggest a social relationship, not just a financial one. These were men who spent time together, who appeared comfortable in each other's company. When a crime boss and Premier League football club owners are socializing together, photographed at matches and events, what does that say about how deeply organized crime has penetrated legitimate society? And what about the Lloyds Bank loan? A bank that was partially owned by British taxpayers after the 2008 financial crisis lent up to £5 million to Hunt's property company after Barclays called in their loan when they learned about the trial findings. Lloyds lent this money knowing that a high court judge had declared Hunt to be the head of an organized crime syndicate. They accepted as partial collateral a £1 million life insurance policy Hunt had taken out just as the trial was beginning. This wasn't some oversight. This was a conscious decision by a major bank to provide substantial financing to someone who had been judicially declared a crime boss. A member of the Treasury Select Committee at the time suggested the Financial Conduct Authority should investigate these loans. But no meaningful action appears to have been taken. The loans stood, Hunt had his financing. The system once again accommodated rather than challenged him. This pattern of accommodation extends throughout Hunt's story. Every time there was an opportunity to hold him accountable, some mechanism failed, witnesses recanted, evidence was compromised, officers who investigated him were themselves investigated, banks provided financing. Business connections remained intact, the system bent around Hunt rather than confronting him. Consider his tax situation. Between 1982 and 1996, 14 years, Hunt declared no income and paid no taxes. During this period, he was purchasing properties, running businesses, and building what would become a substantial empire. In 2013, when questioned in court about how he could afford a £600,000 mansion while declaring no income, Hunt simply said he couldn't recall. He couldn't explain where the money came from. This should have triggered an immediate investigation by tax authorities. Unexplained wealth of that magnitude is precisely what financial investigators look for. But there's no evidence of serious action being taken. Hunt continued to own his properties, operate his businesses, and live in his mansion. The tax authorities, like so many other institutions, failed to effectively act. The offshore company revealed in the Panama Papers is another example. Hunt owned EMM Limited, a company incorporated in an offshore jurisdiction and used to hold ownership of an iron and steel business in East London. This is a classic money laundering structure. Offshore companies obscure beneficial ownership, making it difficult for authorities to trace assets and follow money trails. When the Panama Papers exposed thousands of these arrangements worldwide, it sparked investigations and prosecutions in multiple countries. But there's no indication Hunt faced serious consequences for his use of offshore structures. At every level, institutions that should have stopped Hunt either failed or were actively compromised. The police were infiltrated by corruption. The courts saw cases collapse when witnesses recanted. The tax authorities didn't pursue unexplained wealth. The financial regulators didn't act on suspicious loans. The corporate authorities didn't challenge offshore ownership structures. Each failure in isolation might be explainable, but taken together, they reveal something more systematic and more troubling. This brings us to the present day and the question of what David Hunt's story means. As of the most recent information available, Hunt continues to live in his mansion in Great Hallingbury. He continues to operate businesses. He has never been convicted of the serious crimes that police reports, court findings, and investigative journalism have documented. He remains, in the words of police sources, too big to bring down. That phrase, too big to bring down, is worth examining. What does it really mean? It suggests that bringing Hunt to justice would require confronting not just one man, but an entire network of corruption and failure. It would mean acknowledging that multiple police officers were corrupt. It would mean admitting that investigations were deliberately sabotaged. It would mean recognizing that the institution of the Metropolitan Police was penetrated and compromised at multiple levels. It would also mean confronting uncomfortable questions about legitimate society's connections to organized crime, the business relationships, the social connections, the financial arrangements that allowed Hunt to operate. If you truly investigate Hunt, you have to investigate everyone connected to him, and that trail leads to places the establishment doesn't want to go. So instead, it becomes easier to let Hunt continue. to avoid the embarrassment and the institutional damage that would come from a full reckoning, to protect the reputation of the Met, even if that means leaving a crime boss free to operate, to preserve relationships with business figures, even if those figures have connections to organized crime. The cost of bringing Hunt down is too high, not in terms of public safety, but in terms of institutional reputation and powerful connections. This is how organized crime thrives in modern democracies, not through brute force alone, though violence certainly plays a role, but through corruption, through infiltration, through the cultivation of legitimate connections, and through the calculation that institutions will prioritize their own protection over justice. Hunt understood this better than most. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a sophisticated criminal who understood how systems work and how to exploit their weaknesses. The tragedy is that this was all knowable. The evidence was there. Police intelligence dating back to the 1980s documented Hunt's activities. Operation Tiberius in the early 2000s revealed the corruption. The 2006 investigation by McKelvey's team uncovered extensive criminal operations. The 2013 libel trial aired everything in open court. At each stage there was enough evidence to act, but at each stage the system failed. And now we're left with a situation where a man credibly accused of running a violent criminal empire for decades lives freely, while those who tried to stop him live under police protection or in self-imposed restriction. Where banks lend millions to someone judicially declared a crime boss, where business figures socialize with alleged gangsters, where institutional failure is so complete that accountability seems impossible. There's something uniquely painful about Hunt's story because it exposes how justice can be defeated not by the power of criminals alone, but by the failures and compromises of the institutions meant to deliver it. Hunt didn't beat the justice system through superior force. He beat it by corrupting it, by exploiting its weaknesses, and by understanding that institutions often value their own preservation more than they value truth or justice. For the people of East London, Hunt's continued freedom sends a clear message. The law applies differently depending on who you are and what connections you have. If you're powerful enough, violent enough, and connected enough, you can operate with impunity. And if you try to stop people like Hunt, if you try to enforce the law or report the truth, you might find yourself investigated, threatened, or forced into a life of permanent caution. This isn't just about one man or one criminal organization. It's about the fundamental question of whether the rule of law actually exists in any meaningful sense. If someone can be publicly identified by courts, police, and journalists as the head of a violent criminal empire, if the evidence can be overwhelming and publicly documented, if judges can make formal findings about their criminality, and if they can still walk free without facing prosecution, then what does the rule of law actually mean? Hunt's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how power actually works in society, about how institutions can fail, about how corruption spreads, about how legitimate and criminal worlds intersect, about how justice can be defeated not by hiding crimes, but by being so bold and so connected that institutions choose not to act. The emotional twist in this story isn't some dramatic revelation or surprising turn of events. It's something simpler and more devastating. It's the realization that all of this was preventable. At multiple points, the system could have worked. Investigations could have been pursued. Corrupt officers could have been removed. Prosecutors could have brought charges. Banks could have refused financing. Witnesses could have been protected. Justice could have been served. But at each critical moment, the system failed, not because the evidence wasn't there. Not because the crimes weren't serious. Not because people didn't try. But because protecting institutions and powerful connections was deemed more important than delivering justice. Because it was easier to sacrifice a few dedicated officers and journalists than to confront the full scope of corruption and failure. David Hunt didn't just beat the justice system. The justice system chose not to fight. It calculated the cost of bringing him down and decided it wasn't worth paying. And in making that calculation, it sacrificed the lives and careers of good people who tried to do the right thing. It abandoned the communities most affected by organized crime. It sent a message that justice is negotiable and that some people are indeed above the law. The people who paid the real price for Hunt's freedom are the ones who tried to stop him. McKelvey living under protection, Gillard unable to attend public events, Guntrip and other officers who faced malicious investigations, the witnesses who were intimidated into silence. The victims of Hunt's violence who never saw justice. These are the people who believed in the system, who thought that truth and evidence mattered, who did their jobs and told the truth. They were wrong. The system they believed in didn't exist, at least not for people taking on someone like David Hunt, and that's the truly devastating reality. Not that one criminal stayed free, but that an entire system failed everyone who tried to make it work. The good cops lost their careers, the honest journalists live in hiding, the victims never get justice, and the man at the center of it all continues living in his mansion, running his businesses, walking free through the same streets where people fear to speak his name. That's the untouchable legacy of David Hunt, not just his crimes but the institutional failures that enabled them, not just his violence but the system that accommodated it, not just his corruption but the broader corruption that protected him. He's a mirror reflecting back the failures of every institution that should have stopped him but chose not to. And until those failures are acknowledged and addressed, there will be others like Hunt. Others who understand that with enough violence, enough corruption, and enough institutional cowardice, you really can be untouchable. The question we're left with is simple but profound. If David Hunt can operate for decades as a violent crime boss, if the evidence can be overwhelming, if courts can make findings about his criminality, if journalists can expose him, if police can investigate him, and if he still walks free, then who is the justice system actually for? Because it's clearly not for his victims. It's not for the officers who tried to bring him to justice. It's not for the communities affected by his crimes. It's not for anyone who believed that the law applied equally to everyone. And that realization that the system we're told protects us has failed so completely and so consistently is the real emotional punch of David Hunt's story. Not just that evil one, but that good people tried to stop it and were destroyed for trying. Not just that justice failed, but that it failed by choice, through calculation, because delivering justice would have been too costly for institutions that cared more about protecting themselves than protecting the public. David Hunt is free today not because he was too clever to catch, not because the evidence wasn't there, not because no one tried to stop him. He's free because when it mattered, when the system had to choose between justice and self-preservation, it chose itself. And it will keep making that choice until the cost of doing so becomes greater than the cost of actually delivering justice, until we demand better, until we refuse to accept that some people are above the law, until we insist that institutions serve justice rather than themselves. But for now, Hunt walks free. The officers who tried to stop him live in fear. The victims never got justice. And somewhere in East London, another ambitious criminal is watching and learning that with enough violence, enough money, and enough institutional failure, you really can be untouchable. And that lesson, repeated across neighborhoods and cities, is David Hunt's true legacy. Not just his crimes, but the proof that in the end, the system will protect power over people, institutions over individuals, and itself over justice.